Look at the clock on your wall for a second. Or, think about the GPS map you just used on your phone today.
Or even just like that piece of granite sitting right on your kitchen counter.
Right, exactly. You probably interact with these things every single day without a second thought.
Yeah, we totally take it for granted.
We do. But what if I told you that by simply checking the time or looking at a rock, you are directly interacting with billions of years of cosmic math?
And planetary engineering, really.
Yeah. We step outside, the sun is shining, the ground feels solid, and we just go about our day.
But beneath that mundane daily routine is a system of just like staggering precision.
And that is exactly what we are exploring in this deep dive. We are stripping away the daily human drama, the news, the traffic, all of it.
Just zooming all the way out.
Going back to basics today, we are pulling insights from a really foundational text, which is a 6th grade geography textbook from the Punjab Curriculum and Textbook Board.
Which, might sound simple at first.
Right, a 6th grade textbook.
But when you strip away the heavy academic jargon, you are left with the stark, incredible truths of how our world actually operates.
It's the perfect lens for this. Sometimes to understand the absolute purest mechanics of a system, you need it broken down into its fundamental principles.
You realize very quickly that the simple concepts we take for granted are actually profound feats of physics.
Okay, let's unpack this from the absolute widest angle possible. I'm talking about the cosmos.
Oh, we're going all the way back.
We have to, because to understand the ground we're walking on, we have to look at how it actually got here.
Right, the origin story.
Exactly. So the universe itself, birthed from the Big Bang, has been expanding for roughly 15 to 20 billion years.
Which is a number that's just, hard to even wrap your head around.
It really is. But our specific little neighborhood, our solar system, didn't show up until about 5 billion years ago.
And it started as this massive, chaotic, spinning cloud of gases and dust.
Just a big cloud of debris.
Yeah, and the timescale alone is something the human brain struggles to fully grasp. Gravity eventually pulls the bulk of that material into the center.
To ignite and form the sun.
Right, exactly. While the remaining material on the outer ring slowly cools down, condenses, and clumps together to form the planets.
8 planets, to be exact. Which means we do have to pause for a quick, respectful nod to Pluto here.
Oh, poor Pluto.
I know. It officially lost its planetary status back in August 2006.
A controversial reclassification for a lot of people, sure.
We're upset.
They were. But it was a necessary one, as we understood more about the gravitational rules of our solar system.
So we have these 8 planets. Let's look at the actual mechanics of how our specific rock moves through this system.
The daily commute, so to speak.
Right, because right now, as you listen to this, Earth is executing 2 massive movements simultaneously.
Rotation and revolution.
Let's start with rotation. We are spinning on our axis from west to east at about 1,700 kilometers per hour.
Which is incredibly fast.
It's so fast. That spin takes 24 hours and creates our day and night.
Our source material has a great visual for this, actually.
Oh, the football one.
Yeah. Think about hanging a football by a string in a dark room and, shining a flashlight on it from a few feet away.
Only half that football is lit up at any given time.
Right. And as you spin it, the dark side rolls into the light and the lit side rolls into the dark.
It's a very elegant, mechanical process.
It really is. I mean, the sun isn't rising or setting. We are just physically rotating into and out of its stationary beam of light.
That completely messes with your head when you watch a sunset.
Mm.
But wait, while we are spinning at 1,700 kilometers per hour, we are also in revolution.
Yeah, the second big movement.
We're orbiting the sun in a massive oval shape, rocketing through space at 107,000 kilometers per hour.
It's wild to think about.
But wait, if I am sitting in my chair right now, spinning at 1,700 kilometers an hour and flying through space at 107,000 kilometers an hour, why isn't my coffee spilling?
Right, why don't we feel it?
Yeah. Why doesn't it feel like we are on the most intense roller coaster in the universe?
It's a brilliant illusion of physics, honestly. It comes down to the difference between speed and acceleration.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, think about being on a commercial airplane, flying at, say, 800 kilometers an hour.
Sure.
When you are taking off, when you are accelerating, you feel pushed back into your seat.
Right, you feel those G-forces.
But once you reach cruising altitude, and that speed becomes constant, you can pour a cup of water, walk down the aisle, and completely forget you're moving.
Oh, wow. Because you only feel motion when there is a change in speed or direction.
Exactly. Earth is the ultimate smooth ride. We have been cruising at that exact constant speed for billions of years.
And there's no air friction in space to bump us around.
Nope, no cosmic friction in the vacuum of space to slow us down, so our bodies simply don't register the movement.
We are just passengers holding our coffee cups in the cosmic airplane. I love that.
That's a very comforting way to look at it.
It is, but I want to go back to that revolution number. One full lap around the sun takes exactly 365 days and 6 hours.
The 6 hours.
Yeah, we always just say a year is 365 days.
What's fascinating here is how humanity has had to accommodate that leftover fractional mass.
Because those remaining 6 hours don't just disappear.
They absolutely don't. If you multiply 6 hours by 4 years, you get exactly 24 hours. One full day.
The leap year.
Exactly. This is why we tack an extra day onto the end of February every 4 years.
It fundamentally changes how you view time.
It really does. I mean, a calendar isn't just a cultural invention or like a psychological tool we created to organize the work week.
It is a rigid, inescapable consequence of planetary physics.
We literally have to hit pause on our human accounting system for a day because the physical rock we live on took slightly longer to finish its lap.
The math of the cosmos dictating our desk calendars. That is amazing.
It's all connected.
But okay, we have this spinning, orbiting rock. If you are a human being trying to survive on it, you have to figure out where you are.
Navigation.
Right. You have to pin down exact locations on a moving sphere. And that brings us to the invention of maps.
Yeah, transitioning from the physical reality of a giant rock to a navigable mathematical grid.
And there's a crucial distinction the textbook makes between a globe and a map.
Yes, a globe is a proportionally accurate model of the Earth. It maintains the true spherical shape.
While a map is a flattened representation, heavily reliant on scale.
Exactly.
The way I think of it, if you look at a digital photograph on your phone, the globe is the thumbnail image.
That's a great analogy.
You see the whole shape, the overall vibe, but you can't make out the fine details. The map is when you pinch and zoom all the way in.
You finally see the individual pixels.
Right. The conventional signs, the railway lines, the bridges, the local settlements.
And maps use a mathematical scale so you can represent massive physical ground distances on a tiny piece of paper in your pocket.
But to use that zoomed-in map, you need orientation. You need to know direction.
Which introduces one of the most misunderstood concepts in geography. Yeah. Yes. There isn't just one north.
There are two. We have geographic north, which makes total sense. It's the actual top of the planet, the physical axis that we spin around.
Right, the absolute top.
But then there is magnetic north, which means if I pull out a physical compass to find my way in the woods, the needle isn't pointing to the actual top of the Earth.
It is not.
It's pointing to an island in northern Canada.
It is. Specifically, an area near the Canadian island of Prince of Wales.
That is wild to me. Why?
To understand why, you have to look deep inside the Earth. The core of our planet is filled with churning liquid iron.
Okay.
As the Earth spins, that liquid metal acts like a massive dynamo, generating a planetary magnetic field.
It's like there's a giant bar magnet lodged inside the Earth.
Exactly. But it doesn't line up perfectly with the physical axis we spin on.
So your compass needle is being physically pulled by that magnetic field toward the Canadian Arctic, not the true geographic pole.
Yep. It's just reacting to a massive underground ocean of swirling liquid metal.
I always pictured a compass as this magical, infallible arrow pointing to the absolute top of the world.
Most people do. And because magnetic north actually wanders slightly as the course shifts, navigators have had to mathematically adjust their compass readings for centuries.
Just to stay on a straight path.
Just to go straight. It's a constant negotiation with the planet's internal engine.
Which perfectly sets up how we invented latitudes and longitudes to standardize everything. We just drew an imaginary grid over the whole thing.
They had to wrangle it somehow.
Right. Latitudes are the parallel lines drawn horizontally, dividing north and south from the equator. Longitudes are the vertical lines dividing east and west.
Starting from the prime meridian.
And we should define the prime meridian for a second.
It's the 0-degree line of longitude that runs right through Greenwich, England.
We basically just decided as a species, okay, this line right here is the starting point for east and west.
And from that starting line, the math they use to figure out time zones is just staggeringly elegant.
I love this part. Break the math down for us.
Okay, because the Earth is a sphere, it consists of 360 degrees of longitude.
Okay.
And we know it takes exactly 24 hours for the Earth to complete one full rotation.
The spin we talked about earlier.
Yes. So if you divide 360 degrees by 24 hours, The result is exactly 15.
Oh.
That means every time the Earth rotates 15 degrees, exactly 1 hour has passed.
So if you open up a map and move your finger 15 degrees east from the prime meridian, the time is mathematically ahead by 1 hour.
Exactly. And if you move west 15 degrees, you are behind by 1 hour.
We basically took the speed of the planet's rotation and sliced it into 15-degree wedges to create our global time zones.
Yes, and if you follow those lines halfway around the world, 180 degrees in the prime meridian, you hit the international date line.
The ultimate time jump.
Because of how the 15-degree wedges accumulate,
Mm.
stepping across that specific line means you are literally stepping into tomorrow or yesterday.
Depending on your direction.
Right. It's not magic. It's just the arithmetic of a spinning sphere catching up with itself.
Time zones aren't just arbitrary borders we drew to make train schedules work.
No, they are a direct translation of the Earth's rotational speed into a human navigational tool.
We took a 1,700-kilometer-an-hour spin and wrangled it into a grid so you know what time your Zoom meeting is.
It's incredible when you frame it that way.
But this brings up a massive point. We can draw all the imaginary lines we want.
Mhm.
We can map out time zones and magnetic fields.
But a map is utterly useless if the planet isn't actually livable.
Exactly. We don't bother drawing intricate highway maps for Venus or Neptune. Why us?
It comes down to the Goldilocks conditions.
The just right conditions.
Right. Earth possesses a highly specific, very fragile set of life-supporting conditions that our neighboring planets simply missed out on.
Suitable temperature, abundant liquid water, and an oxygen-enriched atmosphere.
Which our source material categorizes into 4 interacting spheres,
Let's walk through them. First, the atmosphere.
which isn't just empty air.
No, it's a protective envelope of gases, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and critically, the ozone layer.
That's a big one. It acts like a planetary sunscreen shielding us from lethal ultraviolet radiation.
Then you have the lithosphere, the solid crust we live on, which makes up about 29% of the surface.
Leaving the hydrosphere, the water, covering the remaining 71%.
And finally, the biosphere, which encompasses all living organisms, plants, animals, and us.
And what's remarkable is how human civilization has molded itself to fit the contours of these spheres.
Give me an example.
Well, for instance, roughly 80% of the entire human population lives on plains,
80%, why is that?
because the lithosphere there is flat. That allows for large-scale agricultural cultivation in the biosphere and makes building roads and railways infinitely easier.
We settle where the geometry of the planet allows us to thrive.
Exactly, but then you look at people who live in the mountains, where there is zero flat land.
Right, they can't just move.
Instead of leaving, they adapt by literally carving steps into the slopes.
Terracing. Just to farm maize, rice, and tea, the environment forces human adaptation.
And then you have the hydrosphere. The oceans aren't just giant swimming pools.
No, they act as the planet's primary climate moderators, absorbing heat. Plus, they are the ultimate global highways.
The textbook notes that the Egyptians were carving canoes out of the biosphere to travel the hydrosphere 6,000 years ago.
That continuity is just striking. From a carved log in 6000 BC to a modern steel cargo ship.
The hydrosphere has fundamentally dictated global trade and connection forever.
But look at how humans behave within these spheres. We don't naturally grow thick fur to survive freezing temperatures.
No, we definitely don't.
So we shear sheep from the biosphere to make coats. We cut down forests to build shelters on top of the lithosphere.
We use what's around us.
But it almost feels like we're just exploiting the system. Are humans just the ultimate planetary hackers scavenging these 4 spheres to survive?
I mean, hacking implies we are somehow outside the system, cheating it.
You don't think we are?
No, I'd argue we are deeply integrated, dependent participants in a very delicate symbiosis. You have to look at how these spheres rely on one another. You mentioned we use the hydrosphere's oceans for global trade.
Right.
But those oceans only remain liquid because the atmosphere maintains the exact greenhouse effect required to keep the water from boiling away into space or freezing into a solid block of ice.
Oh, wow.
We use the biosphere's forests for timber, but those same forests serve as the lungs of the planet, absorbing the carbon dioxide we exhale and pumping out the oxygen our cells need to function.
It's basically a giant spaceship life support system.
Exactly. Even with all our concrete cities and advanced technology, modern human life is entirely tethered to these ancient balances.
Everything relies on everything else.
If the atmosphere's composition shifts slightly, the hydrosphere's temperature changes,
Which destroys the biosphere's crops.
which starves the humans on the lithosphere.
Yeah.
If one piece of the machine breaks, the whole system shudders.
A terrifyingly delicate house of cards. But let's look at the literal foundation of that house, the lithosphere.
The rocks.
Yes, because all of our human achievements, our cities, our roads, our terraced farms, sit right on top of the planet's crust.
And reading about what that crust is actually made of completely changes how you see a simple stone.
Rocks aren't just boring, static, gray lumps.
Not at all. Rocks are the physical memory of the planet's history. And to understand them, you build from the ground up.
The textbook breaks this down nicely.
It does. The simplest forms of matter are elements. Elements chemically bond to create minerals like quartz or calcium.
And when you squish two or more minerals together, you get a rock.
Yeah. And the Earth essentially runs a massive planetary bakery to cook these rocks in 3 different ways.
I love this bakery analogy. Let's start with igneous rocks.
These are born from fire, from molten magma, deep underground.
Think of magma like boiling liquid sugar. When it cools, it hardens into hard candy.
But the speed of the cooling changes everything.
How so?
Well, if that magma stays deep inside the Earth and cools incredibly slowly over thousands of years, it forms intrusive igneous rocks.
Because it cooled so slowly, the minerals had time to organize and grow into large, beautiful crystals. Granite and diorite are perfect examples.
But if that same magma erupts out of a volcano onto the surface as lava, the freezing air hits it and it cools almost instantly.
Right, and that creates extrusive igneous rocks like basalt or obsidian.
The liquid sugar flashes into solid rock so fast that crystals never have a chance to form, leaving it smooth or glassy.
The exact same ingredients, but the timing of the temperature drop completely dictates the rock's physical identity.
That's the first type. Then we have sedimentary rocks.
If igneous rocks are hard candy, sedimentary rocks are a giant layer cake made of recycled leftovers.
Over millions of years, wind, rain, and rivers break down older rocks.
Those tiny fragments get washed away, settle at the bottom of lakes or oceans, and layer on top of each other.
And the sheer weight compresses them into solid rock mechanically, giving us sandstone or shale.
But they can also form chemically, right?
Yeah, when a body of water evaporates, it leaves behind concentrated dissolved minerals that solidify into rock salt or gypsum.
And my personal favorite, they can form organically.
The biosphere actually becomes the lithosphere.
Yes, the remains of dead plants and marine animals pile up, and over millions of years, the pressure turns those fossils into coal.
Or calcareous rocks like limestone. It is literal planetary recycling.
Which brings us to the final type, metamorphic rocks.
This is where the Earth takes that sedimentary layer cake or even a piece of igneous hard candy and tosses it into a blazing hot panini press.
I love that, a giant panini press.
Extreme temperature from the Earth's core and crushing pressure from the tectonic plates fundamentally alter the atomic structure of the rock.
Without ever actually melting it back into magma, right?
Exactly. It's an alchemy of pressure. The rock doesn't melt.
The classic example is taking soft clay, compressing and baking it until it becomes a hard slate or brick.
Or taking ordinary dull limestone, putting it under massive geological stress, and pulling out a slab of beautiful shining marble.
The panini press analogy is spot on. It just reorganizes itself to survive the immense stress it's being put under.
But wait, this brings up a massive mechanical question for me.
What's that?
If intrusive igneous rocks, like the granite, with the big, beautiful crystals-only form when magma cools super slowly miles and miles deep underground.
Yeah.
How are we finding them on the surface? People have granite countertops in their kitchens right now.
That is the perfect question to tie this all together, because it reveals the invisible engine driving the lithosphere.
The Earth's crust isn't a solid static shell.
No, it's cracked into massive tectonic plates that are constantly moving, driven by the heat of the core.
Think of it like a giant slow-motion conveyor belt.
Over millions of years, these plates crash into each other. When they collide, the crust buckles and is violently pushed upward.
Creating entire mountain ranges.
Exactly, so the deep underground rock gets thrust up into the sky.
And at the same time, the hydrosphere and atmosphere are attacking from above. Wind, rain, and glaciers constantly grind away at the top layers of the mountain.
So tectonic forces push the deep rock up like an elevator.
And erosion scrapes away the ceiling above it.
Eventually, the granite that was baked 10 miles underground is sitting exposed in the open air.
Ready to be quarried and polished for your kitchen.
It's just awe-inspiring when you trace the mechanics of it. It's a completely enclosed, perpetually moving system.
It really brings our whole journey full circle.
We started 15 billion years ago with a cosmic explosion. We watched a swirling dust cloud condense into an 8-planet solar system.
We realized that our desk calendars and time zones are just mathematical tools we invented to cope with living on a rock that spins 15 degrees every hour.
We explored how 4 incredibly fragile spheres interact to keep our oceans from boiling and our lungs full of oxygen.
And finally, we saw how the very ground beneath our feet is a constantly recycled, pressurized recipe baked in a planetary oven.
It completely reframes how you walk through your day.
This kind of deep dive isn't just about collecting trivia for a geography quiz. It's about fundamental awareness of your surroundings.
Next time you check your phone to see what time it is, or look at a map, or even just step on a piece of granite on the sidewalk,
Realize what is actually happening. You aren't just existing against a static background.
you are actively participating in the majestic, spinning, mathematically precise clockwork of the planet.
You really are a tiny piece of the machine.
And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over today. We've talked entirely about Earth,
Our home.
right? We've seen how drawing maps, calculating longitudes, and understanding the spheres allowed human beings to survive and ultimately thrive.
Making those maps is what turned this wild, dangerous spinning rock into something we recognize as home.
But right now we have satellites using these exact same mapping principles to chart the craters of the moon and the valleys of Mars.
That's true.
If the act of mapping and understanding a planet's mechanics is what allows humanity to conquer it, will mapping those distant rocks eventually change our definition of where home actually is?
Man, it makes you look at the night sky entirely differently.
Absolutely. Keep looking up, and thanks for exploring the user manual of the planet with us on this deep dive.